Hello friends, my name is JJ, and check out this thing. It is a little poster I bought on eBay the other day, outlining the essence of the American way of life. It is called the American Credo, and it was printed by something called the Freedoms Foundation at Valley Forge sometime in the early 1950s. At one time, posters like this were very popular in the US and Canada and other parts of the Western world as well. During the so-called mid-century era that came right after World War II, a lot of intellectuals and statesmen were really obsessed with the idea of writing down as explicitly as possible their understanding of the rights and freedoms that had triumphed in the war, and which they believed should define the peace of the post-war world. And they made these affirmations into posters and pamphlets and things as part of a larger ideological movement of what we could call mid-century liberal triumphalism. And I've always found this kind of thing inspiring because it represents a relatively unified moment of philosophical clarity on the part of the West that we haven't really seen since. So, at the root of mid-century liberal triumphalism was basically a fear of another, even more terrible world war that would be fought with nuclear weapons. And that fear inspired a lot of serious analysis about what had caused the last war, with the mainstream conclusion being that it was tyrannical government. The totalitarian ideologies animating the fascist governments of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, it was argued, are what caused them to wage war on the rest of the world and commit some of the worst atrocities in all of human history. Therefore, the victors of that war had a moral obligation to promote anti-tyrannical ideas at home and abroad as much as possible in order to ensure lasting peace and safety for all of mankind. So today, I thought we would look at a couple of documents from the era of mid-century liberal triumphalism and see how the big shots of that time conceptualized the sorts of rights and freedoms that they believed represented the essence of this grand moral project. So the first thing I want to talk about is this: the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When the UN first approved this thing back in 1948, they explicitly called for it to be disseminated, displayed, read, and expounded principally in schools and other educational institutions. To this day, it is still probably one of the most famous things that the UN has ever done. So the United Nations was founded by the Allied powers a few weeks after the German surrender. Every participating country appointed a delegate to the first ever UN General Assembly, which then split into various smaller committees to do various things. The first American delegate was Eleanor Roosvelt, who at that time was one of the most famous people in the world. She was the widow of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the popular US president who had led America through the war, and a woman deeply admired in her own right as an eloquent defender of Allied values. Eleanor was unanimously elected head of the UN's Human Rights Committee, which as its first order of business set out to write a document outlining the values that should govern the new peaceful, non-tyrannical world order. In theory, Eleanor Roosevelt worked with a bunch of delegates from other countries to come up with the precise wording of the declaration, but according to the sources I read, in practice, it was mostly just written by Eleanor's Canadian advisor, John Humphrey, with the two of them then largely ignoring the input of everyone else, as we can see in this delightful reenactment made for Canadian TV.
No, Mr. Humphrey. This Universal Declaration of Human Rights that you are trying to impose.
Mrs. Roosevelt and I only drafted the declaration. It will be up to you and your fellow delegates to adopt or reject.
But what you are proposing is that individual human rights should override a nation's legislation.
Well, that the state would no longer be above the law.
C'est absurde. It would compromise the very sovereignty of the Republic.
Yes, I believe it will.
In any case, the declaration that they came up with consists of 30 articles, each outlining a key principle of human rights. The most dramatic ones include a complete rejection of slavery, a disavowal of arbitrary arrest and cruel and unusual punishment, an acknowledgement that everyone has a right to a justice system that presumes they are innocent until proven guilty, an affirmation that everyone has a right to freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, a recognition recognition of a representative democracy as the only just form of government, and several statements emphasizing that one's human rights must not be ignored on the basis of distinguishing characteristics like race, language, sex, or religion. Today, these are relatively uncontroversial concepts that we associate with functional liberal societies, and even at the time, most countries claimed to believe in them. When the final vote on the declaration came before the UN General Assembly on December 10th, 1948, only 8 of the 51 UN member countries did not vote in favor. And those 8 were Saudi Arabia, whose fundamentalist Islamic government was theologically opposed to the idea of gender equality; South Africa, which had a government based around the segregation of the races; and the 6 communist countries of Eastern Europe. That last group is interesting because it validated the growing Cold War suspicions of many leaders in the West, including Mrs. Roosevelt, who believed that the Soviet Union and its allies were forming a new totalitarian society, not that much different than Nazi Germany. The communists would have been very offended by that analogy, however, because they said the only reason why they were opposing the Human Rights Declaration was because they were so anti-Nazi. They argued that one of the big lessons of the previous war was that you cannot grant rights of free expression and political organization to fascist groups who are committed to destroying freedom, and that they had no intention of doing this in their countries. And in fairness to the communists, this is indeed a paradox that democratic societies still wrestle with. But we also know how the communist governments of Eastern Europe applied this alternative philosophy in practice. They just went around declaring anyone who disagreed with them to be fascists and then justified taking away their rights on that basis. All right, so let us now take a look at some of the lesser-known rights in the UN Human Rights Declaration, because there's a couple in here that reflect assumptions about freedom that have become decidedly less mainstream over the course of the last couple of decades. One is Article 12, which says, "No one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home, or correspondence, nor to attacks upon his honor and reputation." Honor and reputation are values that have historically played a large role in many human cultures, but today, I think we are more apt to recognize them as concepts that can undermine individual accountability in a free society. If we had to write a clause like this today, I think we would probably say something more like, people have a right not to be slandered or libeled, implying that attacks on honor or reputation are only bad if they are based on lies. Article 16 declares that men and women of full age have the right to marry and found a family, and that the family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state. This sort of language has made news in Ireland lately because they have a similar clause in their constitution that has become increasingly controversial, and there is a movement to get rid of it. It implies that families are primarily the products of heterosexual married couples, which we know doesn't have to be the case anymore. And then Article 15 says everyone has a right to a nationality. This can be controversial depending on how you define nationality. The Declaration doesn't mention citizenship anywhere, so you could interpret Article 15 as meaning that everyone has a right to be a citizen of a nation, which is indeed an essential right if you want to travel around the world under our current system of international law. But if a right to a nationality means that you have a right to be a member of any nation you want, then that becomes a more politically contentious right that most countries do not claim to believe. Separatist movements, for instance, are led by people who believe that they have a right to a particular nationality that is different from the one they were born into. Yet this is not a right that separatists are able to enjoy in most places unless they are prepared to go through a long and arduous democratic process at best. In any case, despite that little clip I showed you, where it looked like Dr. Humphrey was eager to override national sovereignty, in reality, Eleanor Roosevelt made it clear from the start that the UN's Declaration of Human Rights was not supposed to overrule the laws of any existing government, nor impose any obligation on any government to do anything in particular. It was mostly an aspirational manifesto a document that sought to educate and inform all citizens of the world about what sort of values humanity was supposed to be collectively striving towards in the shadow of what the preamble called barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind.
If we observe these rights for ourselves and for others, I think we will find that it is easier in the world to build peace, because war destroys all human rights and freedoms.
Now, many of the countries that established free and democratic political systems after the war took a lot of inspiration from the UN Human Rights Declaration and even put some of its language in their new constitutions. But what about the countries that were already free? How did they affirm their commitment to the new post-war liberal order? Well, let us look at something that some folks in Mrs. Roosevelt's country did. The United States Constitution had already contained its own Charter of Rights for over a century and a half, but that was also a bit of a problem. Patriotic though they were, a lot of American elites in the mid-century thought that a handful of rights written in the 1700s were not sufficient to explain the form of American freedom that actually existed. And one group that decided that they could come up with a better list of American rights was the Freedoms Foundation at Valley Forge that I mentioned earlier. This was a relatively conservative, but still classically liberal group that had been set up by some rich guys in 1949 under the chairmanship of Dwight David Eisenhower. General Eisenhower was another much beloved American who had emerged from the war years. He had been the chief commander of the Allied forces and would go on to serve as President of the United States from 1953 to 1961. But during the late 40s and early 50s, he busied himself with a lot of smaller jobs, and the Freedoms Foundation was one. This little poster was one of the main educational things that they put out. It illustrates the supposed essence of the American way of life by means of a sculpture metaphor. The Freedoms people were very pleased with this metaphor and even built a giant stone one at their Valley Forge headquarters, and they sold smaller ones made of styrofoam that could be used in classrooms across the nation. So you can see at the bottom here, we have fundamental belief in God, and then on top of that, we have constitutional government designed to serve the people. And then on top of that, we have 17 distinct political and economic rights. Obviously, this idea that American freedoms rest on a fundamental belief in God is something that most people don't really buy into these days in our more secular times. But in the 40s and 50s, it was common to link both fascism and communism to godlessness, and to view atheism as sort of the thin edge of that particular wedge. Beyond that, the 17 rights of the American Credo are also interesting to the extent that they are only partially based on those found in the Bill of Rights. Once again, an implicit concession that those rights were no longer sufficient to explain American freedom anymore. One notable omission is that the American Credo makes no mention of the right to bear arms, which tracks with what I've heard, that people didn't really consider the Second Amendment to be that big of a deal until relatively recently. And you can interpret that from both a pro-gun rights and anti-gun rights perspective. But overall, most of the rights here are basically the same as the ones found in the UN Declaration. Free speech, democratic government, innocent until proven guilty, right to privacy, freedom of movement. A lot of freedoms relating to work are recognized here as well, including the right to work in callings and localities of our choice, and the right to go into business, compete, and make a profit. Those might strike you as overtly capitalistic values, indicating the atmosphere of anti-communist stridency in which this was made, but the UN Declaration actually contains those same rights as well, just phrased slightly differently. The most explicitly capitalistic difference is that the American Credo says Americans have a right to bargain for goods and services in a free market, while the UN Declaration doesn't identify an ideal form of economy. The UN Declaration likewise recognizes a man's right to form and join trade unions for the protection of his interests, while the American Credo says we have a right to bargain with our employers and employees. The difference here is interesting to me because it kind of seems like you have to have both of these things for these rights to make sense. A union is useless unless it can bargain with the employer, but bargaining with an employer often requires being in a union. The most glaring difference between these two documents, however, is that the American Credo does not include any explicit mention of any right to not be discriminated against on the basis of sex or race or any other status. That was, of course, the great blind spot in a lot of mid-century efforts to celebrate the American way. The degree that a lot of American freedoms had never been fully extended to a lot of American minorities and wouldn't be until the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Though at the same time, it is often said that the act of talking so much about rights and freedoms in the aftermath of World War II is part of what helped make the hypocrisy of American prejudice so brazen that it had to be addressed. Now, up here in mid-century Canada, folks were eager to participate in the post-war celebration of liberal democracy as well. As I mentioned earlier, the text of the UN Declaration of Human Rights had been largely authored by a Canadian, John Humphrey, a law professor from Quebec who was well-versed in the traditions of Anglo-American rights. Although, it should be noted that while he was working with Mrs. Roosevelt, Dr. Humphrey was not acting as any sort of official representative of the Canadian government. In fact, the Canadian government of the time actively disliked his UN Declaration of Human Rights because they thought a few of the more aspirational rights, claiming that people had a right to things like housing and medical care and social services, sounded a bit too communist. Canada actually came quite close to joining South Africa and Saudi Arabia in refusing to approve it. By 1960, however, Canada had a new government headed by a guy named John Diefenbaker. Today, he is considered one of the less important of Canada's post-war prime ministers, but he was a very ambitious man who was determined to leave his stamp on the country. Diefenbaker was a trial lawyer by training and a great romantic about Canada's English common law tradition. The rise of fascism and communism abroad had made him even more defensive, and when he became prime minister in 1957, he was really fixated on this idea of creating something that would redeclare those things which have made Canada great. So in 1960, his government passed the Canadian Bill of Rights, and they printed out these nice little posters of it, which they sent to all of the classrooms and city halls and community centers across Canada. Diefenbaker was super proud of this document and truly believed in his own cocky Diefenbaker way that it would become one of the major symbols of post-war Canadian democracy. You can see he even put it in the end papers of his memoirs. So, what's in it? Well, the Canadian Bill of Rights mostly just lists off the same principles of the other two things we've looked at, including freedom of speech, religion, assembly, property. It says rights can't be denied on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, or sex. Like the American Credo, it declares that Canada is a country that acknowledges the supremacy of God, and like the UN Declaration, it recognizes the position of the family as a sacred thing. It does not, however, contain a few of the rights that the other two do, including the right to privacy, the right to vote, and the right to make a living from a freely chosen career. Instead, reflecting his background as a trial lawyer, the Diefenbaker Bill of Rights devotes a lot of space to acknowledging the rights of someone accused of a crime in the way that the other two don't. This includes the right to swiftly retain counsel after being arrested, the right to refuse self-incrimination, and even the right to a courtroom interpreter. Today, the Canadian Bill of Rights is obscure to the point where the original posters from the 60s now sell for hundreds of dollars on eBay. I would suspect that a lot of Canadians watching this have never even heard of it. And that's because it was once again a mostly aspirational document. It was not a part of the Canadian Constitution, it was not a criminal law, it was basically just a symbolic acknowledgement of the values that Canada was supposed to operate by. In 1982, Canada became fully independent from Great Britain, and a Charter of Rights was added to the Canadian Constitution. And this document is now one of the major foundations of Canadian law, akin to the American Bill of Rights. Parts of it clearly take inspiration from the Diefenbaker Bill of Rights, but because it was written 20 years after the Romantic era of mid-century liberal triumphalism, it is a less poetic document that instead focuses on the purely practical considerations of establishing a workable regime of Canadian civil rights. So, why did I make this video? Well, one thing that I wanted us to remember was the degree that people in the middle of the last century thought about human rights as a kind of collective bundle. The reason why it was popular to make posters in particular was because mid-century elites wanted us to think of our rights as a package of principles that had to coexist with one another in order to be properly understood. No one single right or freedom on its own was enough to protect society from tyranny or keep peace in the world. They all had to work together. These days, however, I think a lot of us no longer think of rights this way. We don't celebrate the overall bundle of rights. We just fetishize the rights that we like the most and downplay or even scorn the rights that we don't personally consider important or don't personally see ourselves as benefiting from. There is also a sense these days that rights are a strictly legal thing, and that respecting and honoring and enforcing rights is something that only lawyers or courts do. Even in this video, I have shown how easy it is to be judgmental and dismissive of all three of these documents precisely because they're not legally enforceable. But back then, people had pride for rights just as things on their own terms. Mid-century elites felt morally obligated to sweepingly and comprehensively identify all of the rights and privileges of their fellow countrymen, or even all of humanity, because they genuinely believed what free societies had accomplished was important and deserved to form the core of mankind's cultural education. In their more grandiose moments, mid-century liberals like Roosvelt, Eisenhower, and Diefenbaker would often claim to be heirs to a great historic legacy of rights stretching back to the Magna Carta. 60 years later, are we honoring the legacy of them?